Probably have a regular stream later, but I thought I would go vertical, as I've been liking to do. And let me know how you feel about these vertical streams and how I use them. If they're good, bad, whatever. I like to use them right now, to respond to comments, kind of get into a little bit, discuss things, just in that way. I think it's working for me right now, but like I said, let me know what you think. So for this one, I want to first thanks to Grumpy Dice for the continued conversation, and also Gus L for responding to my last live, I think, or at least part one. Turned out to be 2 lives, but part one, talking about real-time kind of mechanics and whatnot. And I mentioned in that that stream about overloaded dice, and that I wasn't that keen on them. And I'm going to read Gus's comment. A lot of people dislike the overloaded die, but often this seems to come down precisely to what you mentioned. They want greater predictability and ways to mitigate the risks of exploration. Of course, players want an easier time. Like all mechanics, they can be overused. However, one doesn't use them for a more quote-unquote realistic or complex game. One uses them to, 1, speed up play, 2, focus distracted players on the specific turn, because individual turns always matter, and 3, remove logistics and turn-keeping/supply tracking duties from the referee, who has plenty of other things to think about. If one happens to have 6 hours to play attentive players and is great at tracking a lot of things in one's head while running games, then overloaded die mechanics aren't for you. Now, fair enough. I detect a little bit of snark in there, but of course it's written words on the internet, so snark, maybe there was more snark than I detected, or less. But I think a couple things here. This idea of course, players want an easier time, I think is unfair. That's not what I was trying to say. I think as a player, and really as a GM, that for my players, that there should be some things that are dependable, some things that you can count on like clockwork. And randomizing all that stuff, to me, is not something that I want. There's enough randomized stuff that's happening all around the players, or at least stuff that they can't in any way control. That being able to say, like, I've got this torch, or I'm holding up this lantern or whatnot, and it's gonna last me this long, and I know it's gonna last this long, and I can count on it. I think that's fair, and I think that's good. And I think kind of putting that down to, well, players want easier time, it's not fair, because there's so many other ways that difficulty can get ramped up, either from the player's own actions or me as a GM or referee. I can easily ramp up the danger. That's not an issue. I don't think we have to do this where essentially it's like, I don't know, Schrodinger's pack, that you never know how much you're gonna have until you open up the pack and look kind of thing, is necessary to do that. In terms of the other points, okay, and I don't even care about the realism part, because I've talked before about dungeon turns that you don't even worry about how long they take, just count the turns. So to me, it's not necessarily about realism. Again, it's that having some things like you have some constants in here. So what are our constants in our fictional universe, and having some of these constants, like a torch lasts 6 or 1 hour, 60 minutes. Again, to me, it's something that it isn't necessarily about realism, but it's like, okay, here, it's like gravity, right? We set a rule for gravity. We don't change it flippantly. We don't say, oh, we're going to roll for gravity. No, we don't. Gravity is something we say, okay, we want everybody to know that. I think that as important as light sources are and we're talking here about, right, old school style playing or OSR type gaming, light, it's very important. I think it is not a negative to say, yes, that is something that we can count on. We can all say how long a torch is. It doesn't have to be up to chance. In terms of the 3 things that Gus says that overloading the dice do for you is speed up play. I don't know. I think just saying that, I kind of need to see the blog post on that, Gus, with some receipts or something, because I'm not saying it can't be the case, and of course, anybody using a particular tool might find it beneficial for them, but just say offhand it speeds up play, I'd like to know how, because I, as the GM, I'm rolling more dice. Instead of rolling dice, say, every second turn for a wandering creature check, now I'm rolling every turn. I have to do some amount of thought and adjudication on what I'm rolling, and then the party has to then deal with this extra thing, something extra happening every single turn, as opposed to potentially every other turn, and then in that case, it would be, the chance of a wandering creature. Hey, Ian. So if you're going to tell me that this is saving time, I'd really need to know more than, more about how it is doing that. This is if I'm talking, so we were thinking of time, right? The other thing I think to consider is, well, what is time? Are we talking about time at the table? Like we set a watch or we start a stopwatch or something, and then we start playing, and how much we get through. Does the same time in that sense? I've just been going through how I would be unsure it is, because I'm rolling more dice every round as opposed to every other round, and these extra dice that I'm rolling are introducing more variables I keep saying round, every turn, and these extra variables are then occurring every turn, so the party has more to deal with every turn. So how does that speed up the actual time of playing through the dungeon? It would seem like that it would have to slow things down a bit, but again, not saying that it's impossible, but I don't know that for everybody I could just say offhanded, oh yeah, this is going to speed up your game. I don't know. The other way we could look at time is time in the dungeon, time in the fiction. Is the party more decisively moving because of this overloaded die roll? And I don't know. I think a lot of it, I kind of feel like it would be a wash or maybe slowed down. Because let's just look at it this way. If I go back and what I'm looking at is I'm referencing it because I know there's a lot of different versions of this kind of overloaded die. I'm just going back to Necropraxis's blog and their original entry from I think 2014. So goodness, 10 years ago, something like that. And sorry, I'm looking sideways. Yeah, so this is posted originally their version, and I don't know if it's the first one, but it's the first one that I remember running across, February 3rd, 2014. So over 10 years ago at this point. Every round, every time the party does something, basically every turn, I keep saying round, sorry, every turn, you'd roll a d6. On a 1, you get an encounter. On a 2, you get a clue or some kind of remains. On a 3, you get some kind of context-dependent timer. They call it a locality, but it would be something context-dependent. 4, you get exhaustion. 5, a lantern, you basically tick a mark for a lantern. Lantern light decreasing. 6, your torch goes out. So a couple things to note. If you're using a lantern and you're rolling lantern, you actually have to keep, or at least their guidance, Necropraxis's guidance is to have a counter for lanterns. And your lantern should only go out every 3 or 4 times that comes up. So that is something you have to track. Hey, Mr. Nobody, what am I doing? I'm talking about overloaded encounter dice, which is a kind of an old school playing trick. I guess you could use it in 5th edition, but it's mostly an old school playing trick. So using this Necropraxis system, if you have a lantern, you still have to track the lantern, so it doesn't actually save you that tracking step. If you have an encounter, well, that's a wandering creature, so that's something you have to do. If you have a perception thing comes up, either a clue or a spore, I as the GM have to determine that somehow. So that's going to add some extra thinking into what I'm doing, which again goes back to am I speeding up my play? Because if that clue or remains, they call it spore, shows up, I have to at least do a momentary thinking about what that clue or what that spore, whatever the thing, what is it? I don't know what it is, I got to come up with it. So I have to roll more dice and consult tables, or I need to come up with my brain. So I don't know how that would make it faster if I didn't have to do this before. If it's an exhaustion comes up, well then the party has to then rest or take penalties. That's not going to speed up their time in the dungeon. And the clue or the other thing might not going to speed them up either because they're going to start considering that. So I don't know how that speeds up either our meta timer or our fictional timer. Because if they have to rest or take penalties, they probably will take a rest if they can. So I don't know how that speeds it up. And then of course, if your lantern gets drained or your torch goes out, then that's something else you have to deal with. I don't know how the upshot of this is that it's saving me time. Now I can see how it's making things easier. Hey, Magnus, in some ways. Easier in some ways than because you're doing it on a cadence than having no cadence, right? Or a different kind of cadence. And then the third one, removing logistics and turn keeping supply tracking. Well, again, Necropraxis's one still has some tracking because you have to track lanterns separately. Secondly, you're rolling this every turn, so you're still tracking turns. And I'm not sure I understand how rolling this die every turn is not tracking, whereas if I made a tick mark when a turn comes up, that's tracking. Maybe it's slightly less because I'm not actually making a record, I'm rolling a die, but then I have to roll the die and adjudicate the die. So I don't know how that, I'm not sure, just in terms of tracking the turns, how that much is easier. Now I get it in terms of I don't have to track 5 separate things. I only need to track turns. There's probably some other ways we can do it. Obviously, I would say, yeah, this is one way of removing some of that, but it has a cost to it. And Gus doesn't really address the cost. I mean, it's a comment. I'm not, we're not in a debate, and I don't really hate the encounter die, the overload encounter so much as I feel like I don't love it, and I think it has some things that people don't tend to focus on or talk about, which is some of the either the weird randomness it does or the extra work that it adds. Because we say it's okay, it's removing logistics and turn keeping, but then it's adding this other element of I have to deal with clues I might not have to deal with before, locality, context dependent timers, or things I might not have had to deal with before. You know, it's not like it's adding a different sort of work, not necessarily a removing work. Don't worry about it, Magnus. Excuse me. Ian says a spore is generally a wandering encounter that isn't an actual encounter, a sign that something is around. Essentially gives a strategic initiative to the players. I get it, Ian. What I'm just saying is that it's another thing that I as a GM have to deal with. I have to prepare. I have to wing it. Whatever I have to do, I have to do it. So it's not less work, I would say, than using the conventional every other turn wandering creature check. The other thing is what I don't understand is this concept of, so in his second, in Gus's second one, he says, parenthetically, right, because individual turns always matter. And the idea is that individual turns always matter because this you're always rolling in this die. Because you roll this die every turn matters. Magnus, I'm responding to Gus's comments about overloaded encounter dice from the last vertical I did. Excuse me. Gosh, I'm gonna drink some of this Phantom of Spindrift for the working man. Maybe clear my throat a little bit. Sorry about that. So Gus mentioned in his second comment, man, parenthetically about individual turns always matter. And again, I think this is just doesn't make sense to me. If I say to you, I have a minute, do the first 30 seconds of that minute not matter? You could say, you know what, we're going to blow these first 30 seconds because we've got a second 30 seconds to go. No, in the same way, if you have 20 minutes before you know a wandering creature check is coming, or at least you assume one's coming, the first 10 minutes don't end up being like, way, we could just blow those 10 minutes because we could blow that turn because we got 2 turns. No, and I've never seen anybody do this. This to me is, like, this is the reason I've never had it come up in a game where we feel like we've got 1 turn and we can throw away because we got another turn for free. No, I just don't see it. What I can obviously see with this this style of overloading the check is that we're simplifying mechanics in kind of a quality of life type situation, which I think is similar to I think ultimately what the real-time mechanics do, or at least what I see the big benefit, if we're going to say, of real-time mechanics. Because I think there are drawbacks there too that also don't get talked about necessarily. But the convenience of being able to hit an hour timer and just say, okay, I don't have to worry about that until that timer comes up, and then we know exactly what's going to happen on that timer. Oh, your torch is going to go out, whatever. Or, you know, the other one from Dragon Slayer. Okay, you have 10 minutes. Set your egg timer for 10 minutes. Boom. I'm not, you know, if whatever happens, if that thing goes off and we haven't done anything, then yeah, we move a turn forward, and I don't need to worry about it until then. And the same thing, every turn, I just do this one thing. Now it could be a compound one thing, but it's a little bit like having a single mechanic, right? And I think that there's benefit to that. Just like I think there's benefit to having a single mechanic in our games. As much as folks, and look, from a nostalgia standpoint, I love having all the different die things. And oh, now you're gonna roll this dice. Now you're gonna roll high. Now you're gonna roll low. And it's a D6. It's a D20. It's a D10. It's a D100. But I get from a keeping things, keeping things in your brain, how having one mechanic I roll, and it works one way, and everything is baked into this one mechanic, can simplify running the game for me. I do understand that. But I'm not sure I understand that how it's just faster in some way, or if you have to focus distracted players. I think, I mean, I guess this is one way to do it. I don't know. I haven't seen that one written up before. I guess I'd have to wait and see. I feel like if you have distracted players, does it matter? Because it's not like in other methods there aren't carrots and sticks for taking too long. Even if we're just doing conventionally, hey, your light resources are running low, hey, wandering creatures are coming potentially, and if there are any other if that stuff doesn't get your distracted players going, I don't know that this is necessarily going to do it, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that you will. But you don't need the overloaded die to do that. You could just roll your wandering creature checks every turn if you felt like that was a big issue. I want to mention that I actually wrote a blog post today, and I will link to it. Well, it's actually linked to, I don't know if you can see the show notes with these things. In the description for the stream, it's up there already, and I'll post it to the community tab. Hey, Krister. Man, my throat. I don't know if it's pollen or what. I'm just swallowing tons of it. That about simplifying light, because one of the things I thought about, kind of in when I was looking at Gus's post, reading it over again, and I went back to the Necropraxis blog and looked up there. Gosh, 1,000 apologies. Looked up their overloaded encounter die, is the concept of light and tracking light, and how when I ran that one-on-one game, that teaching game with Daniel, he tracked light for me, which I think is ultimately what if you had your way, what you want to do is get your players to do this tracking for you, where you're talking about turns passing, and then the party checks off their light being spent. Okay, check. All right, this hour, yeah, great. That torch is done. I light a new torch. Okay, check. These turns are passing. We need to take a rest. Great. Because when you look at it, some of the things that's coming up and then overload and counter die are those things that normally you have to track. Oh, we've done 5 turns after an hour, so now there should be a rest turn. Daniel was nice enough to point that out for me. Like, okay, I need to take a rest, so I'm going to take a rest. If you don't have players who are willing to do that, and you have that burden on yourself as a quality of life thing, the overloaded die does allow you to kind of incorporate that. Now, I think my point of view would be, what's better long term would be to train your players, to get your players to embrace and help you track this stuff instead of randomizing it, potentially adding a whole bunch of chance in there instead of them tracking. Hey, just have them help you track it. Just, do that. Be part of the gamesmanship. And so this blog post I wrote was essentially about applying some of this logic a little bit to light. And the idea was, and I stole a phrase, or I stole a term. It's an outmoded term for measuring light, I guess, luminosity, brightness of light, called candle power. And what the idea is that you take all your different light sources. Really, we're talking torches and oil, right? Because lanterns really just a converts oil to light. You pour the oil in, you light. We're not the lantern itself is just the device, whereas the torch is the thing that actually burns. So you have your kind of torch sticks, your torches, and you have oil. There may be other outside of magic fuels and light source fuels. I'm not sure, but those are the two I'm working with. And you essentially so I suggest that candle power as a unit be equal to 1 turn's worth of light, 1 dungeon turn's worth of light. So by default, about 10 minutes. But again, it doesn't matter how long your dungeon turn is. Just 1 turn of light is 1 candle power. Then you can convert your inventory of torches or oil to candle power. And depending on how much you want to abstract it, you could just get rid of the thing and just say, I have this much candle power available. And then there's some device, either a lantern, or you could just say, well, if we have no lantern, they're torches. If you care about keeping them separate, you can. If you just want to say, I just want to know that you have light and I don't really care where it's coming from, sort of thing, then you can have just candle power. So if you have 4 torches, 4 times 6, 24 candle power. And if you're playing in person or maybe in a VTT, you could actually have this. I was thinking in my mind, I was envisioning almost if you're playing around a table and you could have your candle power as poker chips. Or if you're a VTT, some other kind of counter, like a currency. And really, it's a meta currency. And every turn, as I say, okay, it's turn 5 or it's a new turn or you've spent a turn, then as the party, someone has to spend one of their resources, spend one of those candle power, or the lights go out. So what you've got is you've taken light and you've converted it into something simple to track that the party can kind of be a hold of. Or if you need to manage it, in a sense of manage it, you're essentially asking for hey, it's a new turn. Who's keeping the lights on this round? The fighter goes, oh, I've got, because I had 8 torches, I've got, 32 candle power. All right, I spend 1. All right, now I've got 31. And I always like that stuff where you could have some bit of physical, like chips or chits or coins or something you could actually keep physically, and then say, and then kind of spend them, and you can see visually in that sense, or as a VTT. But of course, you can always track it on a sheet, kind of how that stuff would go down. And so you can get into this cadence of, all right, it's a new turn. I spending a light in a sense. New turn, spend a light. New turn, spend a light, kind of thing. And you can kind of get it into your flow of running your dungeon turns. Could help simplify things, kind of puts a little bit on the party. It's also easy, especially if you are doing it visually in some way. It's easy for everyone to share and see kind of, okay, how much light do we have left? But it doesn't do it in a way that kind of eliminates light. Like, oh, you just have light forever. It just eliminates it. And then, we're not doing that, right? I want to keep it as something meaningful. I just want to make the tracking parts easier. And then you can kind of pick at levels of how far you want to get into it with tracking it, or with whether you want to track it in detail or just track it as an overall kind of just candle power, or whether you want to have 8 torches parenthetically candle power, or 8 torches 32 candle power. The other thing is it's easy to convert backwards, because one of the things I don't necessarily like about usage dice and those things is that you buy a bunch, you just don't have that sense of how many you actually have. Right, if I have a D8's worth of torches, what is that in actual torches? Like, I don't know, maybe I just can't get my brain around it, but I'm almost like, well, how many torches is that actually? And of course the answer is like, you don't really know. Spend one and you'll find out. But this you can easily convert back, because it's just, hey, if a torch is 6 candle power, so you know what, you want to take your torch and toss it down a well to illuminate potentially the next level of the dungeon, then just subtract 6 candle power and toss the thing down the well. Bada bing, bada boom, done. Oh, you guys have a lantern, but you want to take your flask of oil and Molotov cocktail some monsters down the hallway, subtract 24 from your candle power, you're done. So you can easily convert back and forth between having the sort of physical, right, the actual stick torch or the actual flask of oil, and then going back and forth between that abstraction. You're not losing anything really in kind of the randomness part. Something that, I appreciated. I posted the blog up, and I also posted at the end of there how at least one way to essentially use this with your overload, because one of the things I didn't like about the overload, or I don't like about the overloaded dice, is how you can end up in a bad string of luck. And we all know that stuff can happen. You roll a bunch of 1s, you roll a bunch of 6s, whatever. And with these overloaded encounter dice, when you're rolling a bunch of these similar results, you just start compounding these things that are happening to you. Like, oh, my torch went out. All right, light another torch. Oh, I rolled a 6. Oh, your torch went out again. Okay, what did I roll now? Now you're exhausted. Okay, now your torch went out again. Like the dice, part of that randomness, part of the fact that it's flat probabilities with a d6 means that there is essentially equal chance of anything happening, and you can get some oddities there. What I did was I took the Necropraxis one, and I took their two entries in there, one for lanterns, one for torches, and I just converted them to candle power. So on one result, you would lose 2 candle power, and the other result, you would lose 4. And now the upshot would mean is that you would at least get, if you rolled poorly, you would still get at least 2 turns out of a torch, and still, I don't know, what's 6 turns if you rolled really, really poorly out of a lantern, since you'd have to get it multiple times. It just means you can control that a bit more, and you don't end up, I feel like, a little bit less of that throwing things away. And probably on average using that kind of system, and of course you can adjust those numbers to suit. I started off with 1 or 2, and then I switched it to 2 or 4, because it's only there's only a 1 in a 2 in, only a 33% chance each round that one of those will come up. So that's there on the blog. It's not, it's not paywalled behind everything. I've posted it to Discord in a couple places, and I will probably respond to Gus's comment about that. And just a way for maybe, and I was thinking actually as I was speaking, that you could probably do this with the exhaustion part of it too. You could probably do something with having to essentially have basically an effort resource for players to spend. So you're doing something, you can spend it. If you're not doing something, you can rest and get some back. And I think the upshot is you end up with a little bit more of a board gamey feel, or almost like a poker kind of feel, where you're sort of anteing it in the middle, throwing this stuff in the ring. But it can really help. One, it can bring those resources to the fore, because I think the exhaustion part often gets overlooked in kind of BX. People forget about that. You're supposed to rest, kind of thing, and there's not the strong emphasis on exhaustion that there is in something, I wouldn't say stronger in 5th edition, but 5th edition, it kind of has more to it than it does in BX. I know there's a little bit of like what happens when you get exhausted and stuff, but it's something that not everything causes exhaustion. I don't think they have exhaustion for overland travel, right? This way you could sort of bring these things out and say, okay, we're going to have this. You're going to have call it effort, call it something else. You can, I would say, like, since normally it's, you get 5 an hour, you could say you have 5 effort. Maybe if you want to say, hey, plus your con bonus or minus your con bonus, and you can even have it linked into certain characters. Maybe dwarves and fighters have extra effort that they can give, and then you're simply spending that effort. And then you can end up in a situation where, well, what happens if I want to spend effort to do different things? And again, it's trackable. What I mean by it's trackable by the players. The players are tracking it. Maybe I end up with 3 resources in the dungeon I'm tracking: my hit points, my candle power, how much light I have, or you could have one person do it, or with the candle power, you could, if you want to be really abstract, just throw it all in the middle and say we have collectively a pile of candle power to spend. So I go, maybe I have my effort, and then I have my hit points, and I'm just spending effort to do things, and then, okay, when you're out, you're out. So, okay, we have to rest because we're out. It's not like a GM fiat kind of thing. Oh, I've decided it's time for you to rest, or, oh, you're exhausted. And I, as a GM, all I have to do is, again, at the top of the round, I can say, do you have light to spend? Spend it. Do you have effort to spend? Spend it. And if the party ever turns up and says we have no light left, well, then you need to rest. Or then you're out of luck because now you're in the dark. Or if we have no effort left, then whoever doesn't have effort needs to rest. If there's someone that does have effort, that they can do something else in the interim. But of course, they probably have to rest later. So whatever, becomes another aspect of, I guess, tactical dungeoneering play, offloading some of the stuff onto the party, but we're keeping it as things that are meaningful. We're not just hand waving it away into the cornfield, and we're not just making it kind of the dice decided that you're tired 3 turns in a row kind of thing, which I don't tend to love. But like I said, I'll probably be back. I intend to be back on later to probably continue working on my adventure, but I wanted to go vertical to reference these comments. Thanks to Gus for his comments, and thanks for Grumpy Dice for talking about. He mentions that I did get it right about paraphrasing his commentary. He said, I'll just to kind of put a full circle on this. He did say that he started thinking about the mechanics, talking about sort of the real-time mechanics in relation to wandering creatures, saying that wandering creatures in their mind, I'm going to quote him from his point of view. Wandering creatures in my mind didn't have to be so codified in the core rules, but the concept was evidently fundamental to the game. They're right there in Arneson's first fantasy campaign. I'd love to know if the initial motivation was more to put pressure on the players with respect to resource management and time spent in the dungeon, or more to create the feeling of a dynamic environment. I mean, I have no way of knowing. Sometimes I think it doesn't really matter. I feel like sometimes when we chase what they're originally after, it kind of overshadows a little bit sometimes just the accident of creation. You create something that seems cool, and only later you realize all these great benefits that come from having it. Who knows? It makes sense that they would want to make they'd want to make a dynamic place. It also makes sense that they'd want to have it as part of the resource tracking. I think the citing First Fantasy campaign is a little bit suspect, because I believe I have First Fantasy campaign, and at one point I'll bring it out. It was Arneson published it through Judges Guild, but it's from the late 70s, and I think there's a lot of question about around, or I guess a lot of unknowns around how much this actually reflects his real original game. Because I think there's evidence, folks have gone into it much more depth than I know or care to know about how this stuff some of it maybe seems to reflect some of the stuff, some of it seems to reflect later stuff. I don't know that if we wanted to look at it and say, what was the precursor Blackmore campaign really like, that you can point to First Fantasy campaign? Unfortunately. It's just one of those things. I think Arneson had a hard time, and I could certainly this resonates with me, having a hard time kind of getting things done and kind of getting things out there and being sort of succinct and concise and everything. So it's just a question of, it seems to be a bit of a hodgepodge between stuff that might have been in his original game but might not have been, and then also things that seem to be kind of newer or different or whatnot. So First Fantasy campaign is really interesting, and it's a great artifact, but I don't know if using that as saying, here's kind of what his game looked like pre-OD&D, I think works. I'm sure John Peterson or somebody's written much more extensively on this stuff, but I don't have it in front of me. I'll be back later, folks. Have a great, if I don't talk to you later, have a great rest of your day, night, weekend, wherever you're watching or listening to this. Game on. Talk to you later. Bye now.